Out of everything in Steven Universe, the most memorable part of the series for me has always been the songs. Whether or not it's because of the thematically dense lyrics, the ridiculously impressive performances, or just the fact that they're terrifically catchy, any musical moment is likely the highlight of any given episode. So, what happens when you make a musical episode of this already very musical series and try to fit 7 songs into one 11-minute episode? You get Mr. Greg, a quarter-hour emotional masterpiece that focuses on the decades-long tension between the two people closest to parents for Steven, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. In this video, we're going to go through the episode, break down every song and beautifully animated moment, and discuss how the show plays to its strengths to properly portray the reconciliation of Pearl and Greg, and set up some of the character arcs for the series' second half.
The sweet stench of success.
Besides just giving the episode a comedic opening, as well as an explanation for why Greg is rich now, the parody version of Comet used in the Pepe's Burger ad at the beginning of this episode is an immediate entrance into its musical themes, as one of Greg's old songs is the only reason this episode is able to happen in the first place. Obviously, the theme of the power of music is going to be portrayed in a more sophisticated way throughout the episode, but I've always liked this goofy opening to an episode, best known for some not-so-goofy moments. Before launching into the next song, we get a quick moment that reintroduces the main conflict of the episode between Greg and Pearl, and more specifically, the resentment that Pearl holds against Greg for how things went down with Rose. Greg makes a comment about how the original version of the song is what made Rose fall in love with him, but that she would likely like the burger parody version too, which is fully representative of why Rose liked Greg in the first place. She loved both the rock and roll romance side of his younger self, as well as the goofy guy that he became closer to the end of her life. It's a really sweet representation of their romance that obviously rubs Pearl the wrong way, as she's once again reminded of how infatuated Rose was with him, and I just wrote 257 words about a burger parody. Before moving on to the next song, which is a phrase I'm going to say multiple times throughout this video, now's a good time to discuss something about this episode that's not necessarily good or bad, which is its length at 11 minutes. On one hand, this is perhaps the least boring episode of television I've ever seen, as almost the entirety of this episode is part of a song, and there are so many of them that each one only lasts for about a minute tops, so the episode flies by in an instant, which is honestly one of the nicest things I can say about anything. On the other hand, moments like this don't really have any time to breathe, as Pearl comments on her Rose trauma, and then the show doesn't really address it again until 5 minutes later when she rejects Greg. Anyway, I still think that the pros outweigh the cons, as adding 8 minutes of filler so that we can get 3 minutes of focusing on specific moments doesn't seem like a good deal, but I just thought that it warranted a discussion. Anyway, song number 2 is this obscenely sweet duet between Steven and his father, and I really love it. It's probably the most acoustic track of the episode, as, at least for the first half, it's somewhat conceivable that the instruments that we are hearing are coming from Greg's guitar. Anyway, the point of the song is that Greg is singing to Steven that all the things that he enjoys the most, such as the bright sunny day and singing with his son, are free, so what's the point of having all of this money? On one hand, the song exists to kind of combat the possible opinion of somebody who's never watched any television besides this episode, somehow concluding that the growth seen in Pearl and Greg's characters is something only possible because of their financial gain. On the other hand, this song really focuses on one thing, being just how content Greg is with his life. A point that Steven will make at the end of this episode is that Pearl and Greg should relate over their Rose death trauma, which is true, but the obvious difference is that Greg gets somewhat bummed out about it whenever Steven brings it up, and Pearl is always one flower away from a mental breakdown. It's this really cool dichotomy in how both of these characters cope that the rest of the episode focuses on in a somewhat roundabout way at times, namely in Pearl's song. And finally, on a third hand that just came out of nowhere, this song is really just a way to musically transition to Greg and Steven deciding to take a trip to Empire City, Empire State. Yes, that is the actual title of the location, which comes in the form of song number 3, which is definitely the most exposition-y of the songs. If there's anything that makes this episode a musical, but not every episode with a song a musical, it's probably this number, where not a single character sings about their feelings, which is a pretty big rarity for a Steven Universe song. Anyway, this song is quick fun, but there's not much to analyze about it, so I'll just comment on the second best joke of the episode at the end and move on.
Empire City! And let's bring Pearl
What?
In case you were dying to know what the best joke of the episode was, it's a few minutes later when Steven is trying to convince the others to go on the trip.
You, me, Pearl, and don't forget Mom.
This moment isn't just funny though, as it brings up the idea that Steven literally has the body of his mother in his navel cavity at all times, which Pearl, and especially Greg, don't really bring up a ton in the series, as they kind of let Steven deal with the emotional implications of that, but just seeing how truly uncomfortable they are with this reminder sets the stage for the beautifully awkward next 8 minutes. Song number 4, the titular Mr. Greg, is the last fun moment in the episode, as things get real emotional real quick after this point. We'll get to that later, but to talk about this song for a second, it's really stinking fun to watch. While this might be blasphemous to those who know what's left in this episode, this might be my favorite song visually, as all the little goofs in it, like Greg breaking a table or Pearl and Steven tap dancing, just make me so happy to watch, and make the drawing end to this one that much more impactful.
You're having fun!
More or less.
So dance with me, just say—
No!
As I try to get back to the point of this video, I do want to spend some time talking about Pearl's rejection of Greg in this moment, which seems overly harsh on the initial watch as Pearl starts to loosen up before snapping at the possibility of doing a little jig with the father of her dead crush's child. But I think all of this is somewhat of a callback to the moment where Pearl first began to fear the possibility that Rose's fling with Greg might be different back in the episode We Need to Talk, which I actually did a video on a few months back if you need a refresher. Anyway, in the episode, Pearl believes that her ability to fuse with Rose is what will make sure that Rose never ends up seriously dating a human, as fusing is the key to any gem relationship. Something that Greg ultimately disproves as he dances with Rose at the end of the episode in what Garnet calls his own form of fusion. So if dancing is the closest thing to fusion for human and gems, and fusion is only possible if both sides are on the same page, suddenly Pearl not wanting to dance goes from a strange outburst to a sudden character moment where Pearl admits that she doesn't feel that her and Greg grieve for Rose is similar in any way, which cleverly foreshadows the rest of the episode. This is a realization that I only really had because of the multiple times I rewatched We Need to Talk back in May, and man, it really does make the whole episode hit a little bit different, and especially the ending. But first we have to talk about song number 5, the most famous of the episode, It's Over, Isn't It? Before getting to the actual song though, we do need to talk about the setup a little bit, in which the show suddenly cuts to night as Pearl walks past the sleeping Greg and Steven, in a shot that's a perfect test for how messed up you are. In all seriousness though, I think it's important for the song to discuss what about seeing this scene makes her lose all control and loudly sing such a depressing tune, which is seeing Greg and Steven seemingly post having a good night despite all of the trauma. And it's this sight, yet another reminder of how much better Greg has handled the loss of Rose, that just breaks Pearl, as she sings a song that's unequivocally not to anybody but Greg. The first verse in this song chronicles Pearl's belief in the inevitability of Rose ending up choosing her over any human, being slowly eroded by the presence of Greg, something that we've seen pretty clearly in the various flashback episodes. Whether or not the behavior of Pearl in those episodes could be described as her, quote, being fine with the men who come into her life is up for debate, but moving into the chorus, Pearl begins to ask the question that'll paint the rest of the song, as in the middle of her going through turmoil about events from 15 years ago, she asks,
It's over, isn't it? Isn't it? Isn't it over?
Why is she still being constantly tormented by what could have been if it's all over anyway, as Rose chose Greg, had Steven, and is gone? The next verse begins to answer this question, as it begins to chronicle how it kind of makes sense why Pearl is so messed up. As she was created to serve one person, did so for thousands of years, fought a war with them, lived thousands of more years as new people, and then in the span of less than a decade, Rose met a new guy, fell in love, died intentionally to give birth, and now Pearl is forced to constantly interact with the kid who's the result of her death and the man who made it happen, all while he seems more or less over it whenever he interacts with you. So yeah, Pearl's messed up, and this song portrays that perfectly lyrically, and that's just scratching the surface of what makes this song so fantastic. Besides the obvious, being that the show uses the fact that Pearl's wearing a suit and is on a New York balcony to create a ridiculously beautiful sequence with some great choreography to match, but my favorite part of the scene is probably the fake out with Pearl noticing Greg's awake. Throughout the song, the camera cuts to Steven slowly waking up, leading us to believe that after this song, we're gonna get the very Steven Universe scene where he goes up to Pearl and they talk about their feelings and why she needs to be nicer to Greg and stop being sad all the time or whatever, all while Greg sleeps away in the background. This scene seems to be setting itself up for that, as Pearl gasps at the revelation that Steven's been awake this whole time. But instead of calling out his name, she instead calls out his father, as Pearl, Steven, and the audience all learn that Greg's been listening at the same time, as just like he did after Pearl's freak out before her song,
Don't worry about it, kiddo. It's always been this way.
he once again sulks in the inevitability of their relationship never being repaired.
Nothing's gonna fix this, is it?
This moment after the song is perhaps its biggest spot where it feels like a minute or two between songs could have been appreciated, but nevertheless, we're quickly whisked into song number 6, Both of You, which is perhaps the least inherently catchy, but almost certainly the most thematically resonant. There are really two sides to this song that are surprisingly distant, so let's focus on the lyrics from Steven during this section, as he's really the only one who sings, as he tells the pair that they both love Steven, and by extension Rose, so they should bond over their shared experiences and stop their feud. And yes, this is all nice and good, and there are some fun details like Steven sometimes sounding like Rose, and for some reason watching an emotional blue figure and a repressed yellow one talk about missing Rose feels familiar. But moving on, I think the most interesting part of the episode that people rarely discuss is the conversation that Pearl and Greg have in the middle of this song that doesn't entirely relate to what Steven is singing about. Here, take a look at their conversation. The pair don't relate to loving Rose or missing Rose or loving Steven or anything like that. They relate to Rose's disregard for how they feel. Yep, that's right, we're 2800 words in and I've tricked you into watching yet another video about how Rose sucks actually. On a serious note though, if you've ever seen any of my other Steven Universe videos about Rose, you'll know I'm more positive on her than almost anybody else who talks about this show on this website, but there's really no debate that, as the pair said, Rose kind of always just did what she wanted. The series always makes it clear that having Steven was entirely her idea, likely because the optics of having a man encouraging his girlfriend to give up her life to have his kid feels bad, but also so that Steven can later realize that her giving up her form to create a less powerful version of herself, who she's gonna leave responsible for finishing the fight that she started against the most powerful entities in the universe, wasn't exactly ideal. Back to this episode though, when Greg leaves the bedroom after hearing Pearl's song, he apologizes for ruining her life, something that is somewhat backed up by her cause and effect lyrics of "you won and she chose you and she loved you and she's gone." The way that the pair get over their feud isn't by suddenly realizing that they both love Rose or they both love Steven, it's by Pearl realizing that Greg isn't the reason that she's miserable, Rose is. Viewing the episode with this lens transforms the last few minutes quite considerably, as Pearl and Greg finally metaphorically fuse as they finally view their past love triangle in the same way, while Steven sings along, perhaps not fully understanding that what they're now agreeing on is Rose's ambivalence towards their emotions. The final song of the episode comes shortly after, with a reprise of Don't Cost Nothing, backed with a piano version of the instrumental, which obviously fits Pearl's motif as she joins in on the song. The trio go back to Beach City afterwards, with Steven singing Pearl's song as he falls asleep to the sight of Pearl and Greg finally getting along. And while Pearl actively disliking Greg and associating him with the loss of Rose might be over, Steven having to deal with the actions of his mother and how they negatively affected others certainly isn't. Okay, I did a lot more analysis in the episode portion of this video than I usually do, so I'll wrap things up fairly quickly. Mr. Greg, as an episode, is a bunch of things. It's a test for a more musical version of the show, something that it does extremely well, which paves the path for the movie years later. It's also one of the most visually stunning episodes in the show, and despite all of the songs, it also finds the time to be one of the funniest. But more so than anything else, this episode is the first moment in the series where Pearl begins to see Rose as anything else but a perfect figure. Everywhere else in the series, when something bad happens because of something Rose did, Pearl finds someone else to blame, whether that be Steven, such as in Rose's scabbard, Greg, such as in most of this episode, or herself, as seen in most of the flashbacks after Rose and Greg get together. But by the end of this episode, after asking why it is that she can't move on from her past, she realizes that it's because she's been blaming the wrong people. It isn't her or Greg's Greg's fault that Rose ended up with him and left Pearl directionless, it's Rose's fault. We don't fully get to see either Pearl or Steven grapple with this in this episode, but by the end of the series, it arguably becomes both of their main arcs. So while Mr. Greg upon a first watch is this musically dense episode that uses both songs and visuals to wrap up Pearl's feud with Greg, the way I see it now, knowing where the series goes, I can see it as a true impetus for the shows and the characters' reevaluation of Rose that will follow in the next 94 episodes. Anyway, that's about it for me. If you have an idea for an episode of Steven Universe or any other show that you want me to cover, leave it down in the comments. And if you want a more direct way to tell me that this video was too long and that I don't understand anything about the show, you can find me on Twitter. Anyway, obligatory Twitter plug out of the way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in about a week with a video in the same format, but with a vastly different tone. Thanks for watching.